Welcome everyone to today's Lead Dev panel. We've got a really interesting set of CTOs who've all been through scaling journeys at a wide range of companies. And we're going to chat to you today about what we've learned on those scaling journeys. If I could ask folks to introduce themselves real quick, just sort of who you are, where you are, and maybe a very brief what your biggest scaling journey has been. And we'll start with Cal from Slack, please.
Hi, I'm Cal Henson. I'm the co-founder and a CTO at Slack, where I've been for the last decade. And right now, this is continues to be my biggest scaling journey. And I'm based in San Francisco.
Cool. Welcome, Cal. Pawan, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Pawan Upaluri, and I'm the CTO of Glossier. And I'm based in Seattle. I've been with Glossier for 1.5 years. And prior to that, I was at Amazon for more than 14 years, built technology for a variety of businesses, starting from the seller space. And the last was Alexa. Yeah, I guess I've had a few different scaling journeys, a bunch of them at Amazon. Yeah.
Awesome. Great to have you with us. Thank you. Richard from On The Highstreet.
Thank you. So I'm Richard Zubek now, CPTO at On The Highstreet, and a couple of scaling journeys. One is at On The Highstreet, where we kind of scaling to get into about 100 mark, and in that scale. Beforehand, I was with ASOS, and I was part of the scaling journey of the tech team from a small few hundred people to almost 1,000 by the time I left and went to On The Highstreet.
Cool. Great to have you with us. And Yoni from Peloton.
Hi, everyone. I'm Yoni. I'm the CTO at Peloton, and happen to be one of the co-founders as well. I think we scaled. My biggest scaling challenge is definitely Peloton, and we started with 3 people when I joined, and we're many more than that, and been doubling for the past 6 or 7 years straight. And continues to grow in a pace that is very mind-boggling to me.
And I imagine made maybe even a bit more accelerated with lockdown all around the world and people wanting to maintain their fitness levels.
Absolutely.
Yeah, cool. I'm Mary Williams. I think many folks already know me, but I've been through a couple of scaling journeys. I was at the government digital service in the early days of GovUK, went from 30 to 300 in under 9 months, was at Monzo through their scaling from a few hundred people up to 1,500. And now at Healx, which is much smaller, AI driven drug discovery, but we have doubled over the last year. So all different scale sizes, I suppose. That's an awkward term to use. Right, so let's start with a question about specifically about scaling and how we've experienced it. So we've all scaled teams in different contexts, but for you personally, what's the inflection point or the particular part of that scaling journey that you found most challenging? I'm afraid, Cal, I'm gonna pick on you and start with you again here.
Sure. I think for me, probably the biggest inflection point as we've grown the Slack organization, and the biggest kind of change and challenge for me personally was realizing that I needed to switch to spend a really big portion of my time on recruiting and hiring. When we were in the not even just doubling, but like tripling of the organization each year, at some points I was spending 50% of all of my time on hiring, interviewing, sourcing, recruiting, and I think especially when you're switching out of that mode of kind of finding product market fit and iterating and building software as quick as you can, and then into making that transition to actually my time is best spent. I can be the biggest lever by not doing anything to do with software and just talking to people all day. I think that was, a tough transition. But it was incredibly necessary, and now that, that kind of pain is behind us by quite a few years, but it was really difficult mental shift to think that this is actually the best way to spend my time to have the biggest output, not this week and not this month, but over the next few years. And while recruiting is still incredibly important now, it's much less of my time for sure. I interviewed thousands of people over the course of a couple of years. And that was a real shift, and it was going from, that really marked the point, going from we're beginning a startup into we're into that real growth phase.
Fascinating. Yoni, how about you?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think I went through a few different stages, and I probably use the number as maybe a little bit of the milestones and indicator. I think the first milestone was hitting the number with the engineering organization, one centralized engineering organization for the whole company, and that's all about how are you going to scale decision making within your team, technical decision making. Before, it was you had a hand in every single technical decision making, but after that, it's also a little more about how to actually decentralize that within your team. And then now we're at a step where we have decentralized technology teams that are embedded within different business functions. And Peloton is a fairly dynamic company in terms of hardware engineers, designers, industrial engineers, all the way to software, right? Software, security, all aspects of it. And now you're encountering the decentralized technology organizations, each of them encountering their number. So then it's about the meta level of how do you actually scale decision-making, technical decision-making across a kind of a dynamic landscape of different approaches to engineering. Developing software on operating system is very different than developing software where we're pushing into your Kubernetes cluster. So there are different approaches to that, and how do you actually scale decision-making with each individual kind of pods of technologists. So, and that's really focusing on what are common shared values and approaches to each of the different decentralized teams. And I think that's the biggest challenge and exciting future for Peloton as we continue to kind of grow in this hyper growth mode. So it's super interesting.
Yeah, I always find it fascinating when there's a hardware or physical component. There's such different things that are the best practice in that setting than, as you say, a big online kind of web app or similar. Richard, what did you find most challenging on your various scaling journeys?
Thank you. For me, I think the point I would pick is the point when you get to the scale when you want or need to go fast enough, more than one team, one engineer, and one cross-functional team working on one outcome or one part of the platform. And there's loads of ways how to then, at that point, there's loads of ways how you can start splitting the teams. Less popular now, but people used to split the teams into front end, back ends, split into different APIs, go by the code base, go by all the different pieces. But it all starts being about chunking it into what is the most logical. And what I find fascinating about it is that there is no one way, which I would say that is the way that will always work, and you should always do it by the code base. You should always try to find the outcome. What I would say is that it's important to maintain ownership. It's important to maintain autonomy of the teams. It's important to be able to link the team's objectives to the customer business objectives and always know what it actually ladders up to and what the outcome is. And I think all of those, maybe in a slightly different way, will support the master, the autonomy and the purpose for the teams. I would keep those in mind, but it is absolutely fascinating part of the journey I find when we need to all of a sudden do more, and there's not just this one team and we all know what they do. Okay, guys, let's go and do this one bit quicker. How do we go and do it?
Yeah, super interesting. Pavan, you've had a ton of experience at like a huge organization, and now Glossier. What's the thing you find personally most challenging on these scaling journeys?
Yeah, definitely can relate to what Cal was talking about and Yoni was talking about. I guess one context of scaling teams that I've dealt with quite a bit is in building teams globally. Either because your business is expanding internationally or just because you go to find talent where it is. And so I've done it working with teams in different countries, but a couple of times I actually I moved and went abroad to build out new dev centers. So in one such example, in a prior life, me and another leader went to set up a dev center from scratch in India. And we grew from, I think, 0 to 1,000 in about 2.5 years. So it was crazy, you know, all the usual sort of challenges in terms of like, how do you hire, how do you onboard, and all of that. But it's like compounded because you lack a lot of the support systems that you used to, and also because you have to consider the local nuances. But the biggest challenge that we didn't anticipate was in having to build a brand to attract top tech talent. Here were a couple of us tech leaders trying to figure out, how do you do brand building? Just not something that was core to us, and we didn't have the kind of support from HR or comms and marketing. And so it was a journey to build our identity, figure out, you know, how we can pitch, build different strategies to bring awareness, looking at colleges and college students, but also how do you get to passive top talent in other tech companies. And it was a great learning experience. And I guess coming to Glossier, which, like you said, is a very different kind of a scaling journey that I'm in right now. We are known for being a great beauty brand, but not as much from a technology standpoint. And part of it is because beauty traditionally has been mostly offline, and the online penetration has been lagging compared to most other categories. But Glossier has been digitally native from day one and building e-commerce for beauty. It's a pretty important part of my job to help connect the dots and bring this awareness as we work on bringing magical experiences to our customers. So looking forward to that.
Super interesting. I always found it fascinating that Amazon in particular had dev offices in countries that there is no Amazon, like Cape Town being one of them. You can't use Amazon in Cape Town, but you can work for them, which is a really interesting dynamic. I suppose I should answer the question myself as well. So the thing I found most challenging on all the various scaling journeys is I'm often brought in at the point that people know that they're about to scale, and so I'm straight into that world that Cal described of, actually the best way for me to spend my time is on hiring, on building the kind of employer brand and those kind of. I personally struggle a bit not having. I prefer to have quite a lot of depth of understanding of the tech and the platform, and so learning how to gain that depth of understanding of the technology when I'm the new kid, I'm coming in from outside, having to figure it out, but also really shouldn't be spending much of my time in the depths of the code base. So let's chat about the technical side of scaling for a little bit. Sorry, I think I was probably cutting out. I just made my headphones stop trying to talk to my phone, which is what was making it happen. What investments have you made that made in scaling from a technical perspective that have been the most worthwhile, the things you're most glad that you did? Cal, I promise we're not going to keep starting with you forever, but I'm going to start with you again, and then I'm going to make sure that we go a different order the next time.
I think one of the things that's been most valuable over the last couple of years, and we're in the approaching 1,000 engineers in the engineering group, has been having a strong point of view around proliferation and adoption of new technology, because the technologies we chose when we started building the organization, there's been a lot of evolution since then. New technology comes out all the time. It's a meme that kind of on the front end there's a new JavaScript framework every week, and it's a balance between, for the long-term sustainability, maintainability, recruitment, it's a balance between picking fewer, more stable, older technologies, or being able to leverage advances in the ecosystem. And so one thing that we did was create kind of a rules of the road around what we think of as our core technologies and how we go about adding to that list over time. Here's what you can pick if you want to have the very paved road. Here are things which are being used in production by other teams and expect some support, and then like, here be dragons, pick these things and you're completely on your own, but that's how new technology gets adopted. And kind of along with that, the idea of like a technology manifests of these are the kind of tools that we're using in production, and these are the things which are kind of solid and in the middle right now. Here are things we're deprecating and trying to get rid of, and here's things we're experimenting with adopting and might be the core in the future. And starting to just catalog that and think about that as a life cycle process. The idea that for any engineering organization at scale, you're constantly in the middle of a lot of migrations and will be forever. And understanding where you are in the life cycle for each technology you adopt, I think has been really useful for us.
Yeah. I'd actually agree. Like making the right thing the easy thing, and knowing what you refer to as the paved road. I sometimes call like the sensible defaults. Let's make it so if you choose the thing that we believe is the right sustainable thing, you get a bunch for free. You get a load of extra support. Your observability, your logging is all, you don't have to do much to get it. But then knowing how you make sure that doesn't feel stale or restrictive to people, I think is a really like a genuine challenge and quite an interesting one. There is a great article called Choose Boring Technology that I'd recommend to anybody who hasn't read it to definitely read. It's a really good articulation of this, and choose what do you spend your innovation tokens on, I think is also it's a really useful way of thinking about it. Richard, what are your thoughts on this? What technical scaling investments have you made that have paid off?
So firstly, I would definitely echo both yours and Carl's view. Absolutely, is knowing what your toolbox is, knowing what things you're aiming for, and kind of keeping it sensible can make teams a lot faster. And yeah, absolutely. If I was to add anything, and for people who know me, this would surprise them. I've learned this from my team. But investing into early good documentation is early worth it. It is, especially when you start scaling. When there's a few people and everybody knows everything in every part of the code base and they kind of all work together, it's less of a thing. Once you get to loads of teams, for the sake of the new starters, for the sake of somebody looking at something they haven't looked for a while, and all of that, having good both technical documentation, APIs, having your standards, but then also documentations when it comes to observability or monitoring, having good handbooks, knowing what to go and do for something, it really pays back a lot, and it helps with scaling. Something, as I said, absolutely learned from my team, and thank you them for that.
Yeah, and if you find yourself in a situation that you haven't yet kind of figured out the documentation side of things, I had the great pleasure of working with Jen Lambourne at Monzo, who's the knowledge lead there, and there's a whole conference series called Write the Docs that I heartily recommend if folks are sort of just trying to figure out what the right way to go about this is. Great news. There's a bunch of people who are like knowledge managers and technical writers, and they've figured it out. We just have to listen to them. So yeah, heartily recommend stealing and reapplying from those folks. They've done some amazing work. As you've seen though, like people and process can be much harder to scale sometimes than the technical systems, and the fact that actually most of us have talked almost about a process related thing in terms of the technology investment is quite telling. But what's your advice to folks planning to scale as to what to focus on first in terms of process or people and process? Pawan, can I call on you first this time to give Cal a break from being always in the unlucky corner?
Sure. I would say people for sure. And a couple of more points I would make is first is hiring leaders for scale in your team. And what I mean by this is not hiring simply based on what we need today, but considering a longer time frame and planning scale into it. I learned this the hard way early in my career, where I did not take this into account and struggled to scale myself as a result. And so that is super important, and starts with that, right? Hiring the right leaders and anticipating some scale. And the other point I'd make is on focusing on team sizes. There's a tendency to build large teams when expanding quickly, and it feels counterintuitive that small focused teams can do better than large teams. But as long as it's they have clear lines of ownership, and when I say ownership, I don't mean owning a project or owning a system or owning a service, but more along the lines of owning a set of customer experiences or a business problem, and knowing the metrics or the KPIs that can drive accountability. really helps in building that independence and autonomy. So at Glossier, that's what we try to do. We have teams that own specific experiences, whether it's like discovery or ordering experience. We have an average team size of about 6 to 8. And we try to build autonomy into the teams in this way.
Nice. Yeah, totally makes sense. Yoni, you had some advice for folks on this one as well, particularly around processes.
Yeah, process have evolved quite a bit, in my experience, and I think the part is, I think it's pretty obvious that don't be married to any process, especially ones that you participate in helping to create. I think the only thing constant in a high growth environment is really change. So be ready to revisit whether a process can scale with the type of challenge you're trying to create or not. And also invest in some. I think this is part where it's important for the process that are very repeated on a daily basis. Really try to invest in automation and tooling to support that process and make that process kind of the easiest way to do something. I think this comes back to our earlier question about making the right way the easiest way, and creating that automation and tooling to make that a way, the process, essentially the easiest way. And that way, when you're adding more people to your team, it becomes a fairly easy default for people to follow that process. So
makes sense. Cal, anything you'd add?
Yeah, I mean, really building on what Yoni said with the, you don't want to be afraid to change, but also don't be afraid to not add process. I think the penalty for adding process late is inefficiency, and the penalty for adding process early is gridlock. Like over process is really easy to do, especially as you're scaling an organization, you come across kind of challenges of coordination. There's an instinct to add process. So adding as late as you can, slightly later than you should have in retrospect, I think is good. The other piece is that it's very mentally hard to throw away process once you've built something, especially once you've thought about it carefully and it worked at one scale. It's it's natural to want to evolve it rather than throw it away. And I think it's healthy to regularly just throw away something that worked when you were 2/3 the size or half the size. Just throw it away and start from scratch again, because the penalty for too little process is slow. The penalty for too much process is death. So don't be afraid to throw away.
You've reminded me of a great quote from Kate Houston, who's I think is at Go these days, but was at Automatic for a while, who said, we always talk about how engineers hate process. It's actually just that when they love a process, they call it culture. And that has always struck me as very insightful and actually very true, because a lot of times when you ask people what they love about a culture, that they'll often get into things that are actually process things, but it's just I think good process often feels like culture, and you're right. Bad process can be much worse than not. How do you balance the need your teams and your organizations have for knowing kind of the direction that you're heading in, with also the realization that the only thing we know for sure is that we probably aren't going to be right in predicting what our future architecture needs to be or what our future plan needs to be. Richard, can I start with you this time?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very good question. I used to work with a couple of people and more kind of in the architecture space, and they used to use the term end state, and that they had an end state for almost everything. And I was always based on when I was like, guys, it's looking a couple of years ahead, absolutely thinking you'll know exactly what it's going to be. The only thing we know, and we all know, is it's not going to be that by the time we get there. And by calling it end state, you're almost ignoring this absolute knowledge, which we talk about it openly. You all know it. And I think kind of focusing on things focusing on more of a strategy, knowing exactly kind of which way you want to go, which direction you want to head, kind of knowing if it is today, what the target would look like is significantly more helpful. Target already means something which you will be changing as you go. As you learn things, you go and update it. As things change, either in the business, in tech, new things come out, as we talked about, a lot of them, you can go and be flexible about it. I was always an advocate of having a strategy. So we know we're doing this way. This is the technology we're using for that. This we're doing in the cloud. This we're doing to do as a platform, as a service, and so on, so and so. But keep them high level enough so they can last at least a period of time, and keep them flexible. Make sure that everybody understands is almost as a living thing, a living document, a living strategy, not something that's said once and then somehow you follow it for the next 5 years.
Yeah, makes sense. Cal, what would you add?
Yeah, I think it is easy as engineers to get married to technical solutions. It's the both technologists like building technology and the sunk cost fallacy. And I think one of the ways to lift teams out of that, because Rich is absolutely right, like everything's going to evolve and nothing that you have now is hopefully going to exist that far into the future. Well, that's a different set of problems, is to try and focus teams on the customer and the problem you're trying to solve. What is the underlying goal of what you're trying to do, and orient your teams and your efforts around that, because that means the technology and the solution that you have today, be less wedded to that than you are to solving the problem as the problem evolves. And I think that's easier to say than it is to do, but is an important orientation for kind of long-term company organizational health.
Yeah, makes sense. And Yoni, anything else that you'd add here in terms of the, knowing we can't know the future, but also knowing people need to have some direction?
Yeah, I think one thing to point out, those are all great points, and one point to point out is architecture, kind of direction. It's closely tied to kind of org structure, right, and team structure. Team structure influences architecture. Kind of, I think Conway's law a little bit at play there. So there's no crystal ball to tell what the perfect org structure is. It's similarly, there's probably no crystal ball to tell what the perfect architecture is. I think I resonated really well with Cal's comment about focusing on the challenge, the business challenge, the user experience, because those are a little more everlasting, right? And those are grounding problems by which, no matter what, how you restructure your teams, how teams reorganize, those challenges are a little more everlasting than the team structure. So I think focusing on that and organizing your architecture and approach to best connect to be able to solve those challenges makes a ton of sense to me. So that's a little bit of connecting and looking at architecture from that perspective.
Yeah, makes sense. If we move on now to talking about probably the biggest topic, or the hottest topic that everybody always focuses in on when we're talking about scaling, hiring. It's always hard, but it's extra hard when you're scaling your culture, your ways of working. They're both in flux. Any tips for other folks maybe going through that kind of journey for the first time? And Pawan, I'll start with you if that's all right. You've obviously had 0 to 1,000 engineers in 2.5 years is scary, even by our standards, I think. So share your wisdom with us.
Great question, Mary. It is truly hard to build and maintain culture when organizations are experiencing hypergrowth. The learning for me always has been to focus really heavily on the core values and operating principles, and build mechanisms to reinforce them throughout the organization, through every team. When a team is small, it's easier to inculcate culture because you have direct interaction, you have shared experiences and all of that. But as the org grows larger, the complexity of communication just increases dramatically, and having a common language and framework to refer to as like guiding lights are super critical. And when I say use core values and operating principles, I'm not talking about printing them and putting them up as inspirational posters on the wall. It's really figuring out the mechanisms so team members can live and breathe them every day. And this is especially important in the increasingly remote world that we are all operating in today. So at Glossier, we did a values refresh, definition refresh, same values, but defining them to be more actionable. So we did that exercise at the beginning of the year, and taking the time to explain what do they mean and how can one demonstrate each value to team members. For example, devoted to the customer is a core value at Glossier. But what does this mean for an engineer who's working on a back-end catalog service or building a data pipeline? It's hard for them to understand. How do we get our engineers to be great creators, but also great operators and really obsess about operational excellence? So at Glossier, we assess for values alignment as part of our hiring process. We give kudos and awards to team members based on how they demonstrate these values. And these are some mechanisms, right? And as a follow-up to the company values that we worked on, we are currently working on operating principles for the tech team. We've hired a number of people over the past year from a variety of backgrounds, and we also have tenured team members. So wanted to bring together the different perspectives and look at our operating principles. So I think that goes a long way in building culture.
Absolutely agree. Richard, if I can come to you next.
Yeah, absolutely. I would build on what Pavan said. As you said, mate, hiring is always hard, and it's only getting harder. But the other thing that makes it probably even more challenging is when you want to do the most of it is when you look into scale. You're probably looking to scale because there's a lot of customer outcomes, there's a lot of opportunities you want to pursue, which means probably you and all the teams are quite busy at that time as well. So for me, the first thing is the recognizing what is actually the top priority. When I've joined Not On The Highstreet, we had not that many engineers, and everybody was absolutely busy and wanted a lot more. The one thing I then established with the guys is we're never going to get out of this unless we go and find more people to join us. And I think the exact phrase I used was, the only thing that's more important than the CVs and interviews is if the site is down, everything else can wait, and do those over that. And I think then it comes similar with the culture. Obviously, at a kind of high level, people will want to join a place where people can follow good engineering principles. There's somewhere to develop. So being able to do it with the team that exists is extremely important, because those are the teams other people will want to join. So always keeping sustainable culture, knowing why you're heading with that culture, and being able to demonstrate it to anybody who can come and join.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cal, it's from 0 to 2,500 people in Slack in 7 years, right? So what's your advice on hiring?
I think what the others have already said is very important, but I can't overlook like the mechanics. If you want to scale, you have to scale hiring as well. And that means having as many people as possible do it. And if you want to be able to do that successfully, you need to make sure it is a repeatable process, that it doesn't matter who interviewed a candidate, you know that they're being assessed against the same criteria. So making that a process that's repeatable by anybody as early as possible is pretty important. So that means, for a given position, document your questions and the expected answers and how you'll score against them. Refine this constantly as you interview more and more people, so that you can trust that anybody who goes through your recruiting process, however many people are doing the interviewing, you're going to have the same outcome for the same candidate, so that you can trust that. Once you can get out of the, if they're going to join my team, as a sub team, they have to be interviewed by my team mentality, and into the, if they've been interviewed at my company, they can join any team and be successful, then that helps you scale immensely.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think this link between hiring and kind of culture and values is also really important. There was something that Tom Blomfield, who's the CEO of Monzo, said that really resonated with me at a particular point in our journey there, which was, it's our values are really important, but our culture isn't a museum piece. It's not in a glass box and never to be touched and never to be interacted with again. You don't want that kind of staleness. You want the new people joining to be able to contribute to culture as well. And so similarly, a really great bit of work done there by the people team, led by the people team, but by everyone, was to make sure that our values were verbs rather than rather than nouns. They should be behavior driven, and then to, you know, to have a distinction between the things that those values, those underlying values, and those being able to play out in different ways as we evolve so that the culture did evolve. And I think that's also important. But I 100% echo Cal's very pragmatic point about repeatable process, and also don't underestimate how fantastic it can be to have in-house talent people. Probably the biggest difference I've made in almost every organization I've joined is to also bring along or bring in or hire or make sure is hired a really, really good talent person. And that kind of sourcing, I literally interviewed a candidate yesterday who went, I have never interacted with a recruiter who actually understood my job well enough to have spotted that I could be relevant for this role that you've got. And I'm just so impressed. I wasn't looking for a job, but I was so impressed I took the call anyway, because I'd never had that. And that particular talent person's been with me at a couple of different companies. He's absolutely amazing. So it's really worth, you know, it may feel like it's somebody else's role, but as a technology leader, one of the best things you can do is make sure that there's a really, really good talent person who understands your tech roles and can speak about them really fluently. It makes a massive difference as soon as you can get that. I know, though, that we're a group of people that care a lot about not just scaling, but scaling in a way that preserves kind of representation, diversity, and inclusion being a part of that, not scaling and ending up with a really homogenous team, either deliberately or by accident. So what advice do we have for people? What have we done to prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion during these periods of rapid scaling and hiring where it might be easy to overlook or possible to overlook? Pawan, can I start with you again?
Thanks for the question, Mary. This is a topic that's close to my heart, just having grown up as a minority group in the tech community. I guess same with you. After spending many years and working on different diversity and equity initiatives, I've come to realize that DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is something that we have to have as an always on focus. Can't be an afterthought, can't be something we prioritize at certain times, but not at other times. It's just got to be something we're thinking about all the time. At Glossier, equity is pretty intrinsic to our core philosophy. If you think about it, beauty and identity are inextricably linked, and our passion at Glossier has always been about democratizing beauty. So in terms of mechanisms, it's just a core part of our hiring strategy. You know, just the same way we don't say, you know, let's lower the bar so we can hire quickly because we're in hyper growth mode. We don't compromise, not willing to compromise on DEI. And when we hire tech leaders, whether they're managers or individual contributors, we specifically look for people who are passionate about inclusivity. And it is, again, a Glossier core value, inclusive. And all hiring managers, all recruiters share the DEI goals. We do supplement with, you know, relevant resources, whether it's like specific sourcing and channels that have DEI specialization, but the core part is what is important. And I think the other thing I'll say is it doesn't stop at hiring, because we need to have the necessary internal mechanisms to develop and retain diverse tech talent. For example, at Glossier, we've been focused on building employee resource groups to promote and sponsor some of the marginalized groups. We have a Women Who Tech group that is focused on women identifying in tech. We have a group called HUE, which is for the BIPOC group. And we have another group that's focused on the LGBTQ population community. The other thing I'll say is just having diversity at all levels in the company, especially at senior levels, is just super important, because you really need role models for others to follow. You can't be what you can't see is what I say. And Glossier is by far the most diverse tech team that I have been a part of. We have plenty more work to do, but it is refreshing to be part of such a group.
Yeah, nice. Yoni?
Yeah, this is a super important topic, and it is so there's I'll give some probably specific tactical advice, but also on the big picture. Peloton has been, I've been fortunate enough to be at a company at Peloton who puts this really as priority number one for the company, as part of essential aspect of building the best place to work. So I'll probably won't go into too much detail on the company level, but I think specific probably advice on technical leaders. This is one thing I've just learned myself, which is I think the team really appreciates hearing from you that you acknowledge the issue to your teams, and I think they appreciate hearing that this is a priority from you as a leader. I think that goes a long way. The other learning that I've had was one feedback was especially in a high growth, rapid scale environment, it's hard to find time. It's hard to find time to do some of the projects. It's hard to dedicate more time on hiring and finding diverse talent. So I think one really helpful aspect is creating that space, the safety and the time for teams to actually do this. And whether it's putting on your quarterly plan, whether it's actually giving the team the safety and the space to brainstorm from a talent pipeline perspective on how they want to change the process to bring in more diverse talent into the team. So I think creating that space is something I found super important as well.
Yeah, I'd add to that. I think the point made about the work doesn't stop at hiring. I think you actually have to do a bunch of work to make your workplace inclusive, to have the right to go hire people who are different from maybe who's already well represented in your team. It's not cool to bring people in and put all the onus on them to change everything around them as they're a newcomer in the team to make things more comfortable. And I think that's, the sort of places where you see loads of different people joining and they're all gone within a year or so. It's often a bit of evidence that maybe that work to make the actual workplace inclusive hasn't always been done. But also don't, the biggest bit of advice I can give here, and I've done a lot of work in this space over the years, is don't wait. Don't wait to do it until you have to scale, because if you wait to make your organization inclusive until you have to scale, you've already got a bit of a monoculture or a homogenous group, and then all of their referrals are likely to be a bit homogenous. And one of the best things to have when you start to scale is great referrals from your existing team. So don't wait until you're scaling to care about this. Care about it right at the beginning. If you've got a nice range of people from all different backgrounds as your kind of seed network at the point that you start to scale, you know what? They're more likely to know a bunch of different people who are different from themselves, but also similar. And so do this work as early as you possibly can. Don't leave it until you're trying to scale, because you end up with a kind of generational difference in representation, which often plays out in pretty unfortunate ways, shall we say. Any other kind of common pitfalls that might not have already been mentioned that folks want to highlight, things that we haven't talked about yet that we might want to? Richard, I think you might have a couple of thoughts here.
Yeah, I did have one. We talked a lot about scaling the engineering, the technology part of the organization. I think it's important to realize that on its own will probably never lead to those customer or business outcomes you want to get to. There's, if I only think as far as, let's say, the product management, the design, kind of UX and other departments, making sure that if we're going to scale, we all scale at about the same pace, and we all scale to the kind of the same target. So the organizations kind of match. There's people for people to work with, and those people are quite aligned, and making sure that it tends to be always bigger than just the engineering, and making sure they all go aligned and go on the same journey.
Yeah. Anybody else got anything they'd add on that point? Good. We've got a couple of questions that are coming from the audience. I'm going to probably just direct them real quick. So there's one specifically for Yoni. How have you scaled the technical decision making?
Yeah. So first of all, I want to just say that I think this might, in my opinion, a holy grail that may or may not be ever achieved. So it's an aspirational kind of a goal that we all kind of continuously work towards, scaling decision making. And what makes it really hard is obviously when you're doubling every year. That's just like I think you're coming out, if you're coming out as some clarity on how that is done, I think you're at a win. So I can share a little bit of some approaches we've taken. I think in a kind of the below the numbers number, it is a little bit of a little more in touch with the decision making across the different teams. You can actually get people together to talk about what's on the agenda from each representative from each teams. But I think as you start scaling beyond the Dunbar's number into different groups of Dunbar's numbers, that's where I also actually reference Cal's comment about the paved roads and golden path. That's actually a pretty awesome framework for tech teams to kind of say, hey, here's the supportive path, and here's what you get. And then if you go off the path, you're off on your own. And so what you're creating is a framework for people to decide themselves on how they want to approach tackling their next techno project, so that there is flexibility and fluidity to allow for innovation, but also kind of allows for that if you just want to get something up, get a project done, there is a default way that's supported, so that you don't have to create the whole entire stack by yourself to get something done. So I think it's really kind of the high growth environment. Understanding the spectrum you're on, and in terms of how locked down you want to be on your technical framework architecture, because that's very different in different companies' environment and your business goals. Understand where that's at, and create the supporting structure, the supporting framework, the tools, automation, and then wrap it up with values, right, around presuming positive intent by other members, kind of a disagree and commit as well. At the level, the decision by consensus is very scary, and it doesn't scale. It creates a lot of work, and so articulating these how your company's value, how the tech values contribute to the specific topic of decision-making guideline are things to kind of craft as artifacts to help the organization overall.
Got it. Yeah. A lot of time people think the only other option if you don't do decision by consensus is dictatorship. If you have it, for folks who maybe have thought that, it's worth reading about decision making by consent, where you basically go, we consent that these people over here who are going to go make this decision, that they've got all of the knowledge and everything that they need to make a great decision, and we're only going to object if it's not good enough for now and safe enough to try. And I think that's that kind of good. Is it good enough for now? Isn't it safe enough to try? As a decision making bar is something that I found makes a real difference. Another. I'm going to limit it to just one answer, I think, but a great question that came in is, how do you start building your kind of brand as a tech employer? Pawan, can I ask you to answer that, given you've been more recently doing it at Glossier from the beginning?
Yeah. I think it's about starting with, going back to the mission and vision of the company, and then being able to tie how that's interesting from a technology perspective, and being able to write that story. And then, there's, in terms of like going beyond that, it's really about trying to figure out what are the different mechanisms you can use or avenues you can use to reach out to people. Again, whether it is reaching out to a few colleges or leveraging network and doing tech talks or hackathons, etc. In fact, a lot of this has developed quite a bit in the recent few years. When I was learning about it, it wasn't as developed, and so we were just learning along the way. But yeah.
That's great. Thanks for the advice. I think we're running up to time, so I'm going to suggest that we just go to our final question, which is, have you got any final thoughts or advice for the tech leaders watching, who may be at various different points? They might be getting ready to scale, or they might be already in the middle of a quite fairly scary scaling journey. Any final kind of words of wisdom that folks would like to share? Richard, can I start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll keep it quick. Enjoy the journey, take your team along, and have fun. It's probably the most you're going to learn from anything else you could. Have fun with it. Yeah.
Yanni, what advice would you give?
I think this advice was passed on to me by somebody else, and I thought it was super relevant after looking back for the past couple of years, which is in a hyper growth environment, your responsibility, you're essentially automatically getting a promotion every year. Without getting an actual promotion, you're just by nature of the growth, you're getting a promotion every year, which means it's a different responsibility, and you should reassess how you're approaching your role. And what I found tremendously helpful is get ahead of it, try to stay ahead of it, and specifically get a mentor, get a coach who have been there where you need to be, and getting advice from that perspective.
Makes sense. Cal, what's your advice for folks?
I would say, going back a little bit to the diversity point, is as you think about hiring your leaders, hire for people who aren't like you, hire for the skills that you lack, the things that you don't know how to do. Don't be afraid to hire people who have more experience than you, especially in the things that you don't know how to do. And that set of things that are your weaknesses or that you don't know how to do will also change over time. Likely your leadership team will change over time. So each time you're making those hires, you're building out a leadership layer, think about the things that are most important that you're the worst at, and make sure you have those complementary skills and complementary points of view. Having a team that agrees with you on everything probably doesn't mean you're a genius. It means that you're bad at hiring. So.
That's great advice. Pawan, anything that you would add?
Yeah, I guess the thing that I constantly remind myself is what got you here won't get you there, right? And this applies not only to us as leaders, but I think this applies even to the organization and the business. And as we think about scaling, we have to regularly assess across all the dimensions, whether it's like people, infrastructure, and tools, and process. And the thing I'll say is it's not always a straight line, right? Sometimes you may need to press the brakes and take stock before you scale further. And figuring out when to do that is as important in order to scale in a sustainable manner.
Yeah, I advise I'm a tech advisor for a VC, and the number of companies that turn up with their, well, obviously we're going to triple in the next year, and then you try and scratch like just slightly below the surface, and there's no plan and not even a reason why, other than they think it's expected, is kind of fascinating. My bit of advice I'd give is stop believing in unicorns now. Don't try going into hiring believing you can find the perfect individual who has all the skills. I suppose a little bit echoing Cal's point, the unit of delivery is the team, and the team needs a load of strengths. You're unlikely to find them all in just one person, and hanging on to believing in unicorns and going unicorn hunting is often where people trip up when they go through scaling journeys. So that'd be my last bit of advice. I'm going to bring us to a close. I think we're at time. Thank you all so much for joining us and for sharing some really excellent experience and advice and wisdom with everybody. We really appreciated having all of you here. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.